Hello, everyone, and you are watching the latest episode of Seen and Known with Alicia Jones. I am your host, Alicia Jones, and I am so excited about this episode because we have somebody who is new to the pod, Mr. Kyle Howard. Okay, we're so excited to have him. And today's episode, I'm just going to be 100% honest. It's going to be a lot, okay? It's going to be a lot. The title of this episode is Healing from Spiritual Abuse. And we have someone who has made this his work. And so I'm really, really excited about you guys hearing from him and us getting the opportunity to talk to him. Now, before we get started with introducing Kyle, I always love at the beginning of my episodes to give everyone a little personal note or a little background as to why I chose this topic. All of the episode topics are not random. They are things that either I have personally gone through or they are things that I feel like I've been exposed through my friends, through my church, through the work that I do, and this one hits a little different. When we talk about spiritual abuse, most of my listeners know a little bit about my background and my story. And so when I say my story, I mean about 10 years ago, I was married. And from there, I started doing the important work of doing ministry. And I went through church planting. I went through a church planting network, a church planting organization, myself and my partner at the time. And we church planted on the south side of Monroe, Louisiana. And if you are a church planter, you know it is hard work. It is difficult tilling work, like I like to call it, where you're literally tilling the ground of a neighborhood and the hearts of people, and you're trying to find different ways, not just for people to come to your church, but more importantly, for people to know God. And so we did that work for several years, and through that work, my ex and I encountered many people that were very broken and many people that had a variety of different experiences with the church. And our goal was always to be a healthy church. Our church had started to become the place where people who were burnt out at other churches would come to just get rest. And we were very proud of that culture that we were building. But on top of that, as with many leaders in the church, my ex and I went through uh, infidelity. I was trying to find a nicer way to say that, but there was no nicer way to say that. So we went through a situation, multiple situations where my ex was involved with people that were either employed or volunteers at the church. And previous to that, someone who was employed under his leadership at a previous church. And so immediately when that happened, I realized maybe a week after I found out, I started thinking about the situation and the women that were involved. And I was like, wait, all these women worked for him. All these women, were like children's, you know, volunteer staff or like assistants or, they were in some sort of subordinate role at the church where he was the leader. And so I know it's very easy for women to just, blame the other woman and take the blame off the man many often. But I did approach the situation with a lot of compassion because I recognized that there was a power dynamic at play. And for a long time, I never thought that was, I'm using quotation marks, spiritual abuse, because I had never really experienced spiritual abuse in my own personal life. And so that led me to have a lot of compassion for these women that were involved. And it was something that me and my ex talked about at length because I wanted him to understand that it wasn't just the relationship that was the problem. It was also being a pastor, being in a position of leadership, and you not realizing that true consent, in my opinion, can't be held when you are in a position of power. And so that is my personal connection. And I wanted to talk to someone who was actually doing this work and had, experienced the true definition of spiritual abuse and could give insight as to what that means and what we can do to try to prevent it in the future. And so that is why we're having this episode today with Mr. Kyle Howard. So, Kyle, tell us a little bit about who you are and about your background, particularly your educational and ministry background.
Hey, thank you so much for having me on. It's truly an honor and a privilege to be able to talk to you, to talk to your listeners about something that is really close to my heart. It's something that I'm passionate about. And yeah, some quick background on myself. So, again, as you said, my name is Kyle Howard. I am a trauma informed care provider. I've been providing care and advocacy for survivors of abuse in trauma for over 10 years now, and focused and kind of my work is comprehensive but more hyper focused on spiritual abuse for about 7 8 years now. And I actually went to back in 2012. My wife and I and our two small children moved to Louisville, Kentucky, where I began pursuing degrees from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Yes, many regrets now on that, but we went
We'll
there.
get into it.
And obtained an associate's in biblical and theological studies, and my bachelor's was in Christian counseling. I actually graduated both magna cum laude, and then from there I went on and did my master's degree with a concentration in historical theology, with a focus on both North African patristics and the Reformation era. Basically, that means the North African church fathers and then the Reformation. And my PhD work was going to be focused on the connection between the North African church fathers, the Protestant Reformation, and the Black church, and kind of showing the thread in regards to how the Black church carried on the tradition of the early church without needing any colonization or white colonial theology in order to obtain that. And by looking at, again, the Protestant Reformation and showing how the reformers went back to the North African church fathers to relearn their theology from Roman Catholicism, and then the a Black church picked up on that later on. And so that was kind of on I guess educationally, academically, that was my pursuit. I didn't end up finishing my PhD. That the atmosphere was extremely toxic, and so we ended up, what I would say is more fleeing Louisville and coming back to Atlanta. And again, we can get into that later on. On the I guess vocational side of things, I myself am a survivor of child abuse, as well as various other kinds of things. One of the and When I was 12 years old, I was not only diagnosed as ADHD, but then also with clinical depression. I had my first severe suicidal crash out, I guess you could say, when I was 12. And I spent my teen years in a really dark place and trying to struggle with trying to find meaning and purpose. And when I was 18 years old in my first semester in college, I had a radical conversion experience that it didn't heal me in the sense of my clinical depression, but it really did open kind of the floodgates of of I guess you could say joy in Christ that helped me process and navigate those things. Not only my personal trauma, but then also depression and those things. When I was at Southern, when about a couple years in, after I finished my degree in counseling, almost the same month that I finished my degree, I was already a lay leader that was leading a community group of about 25 to 30 people. So it was almost the size like a small church, right?
Yeah.
And it was multi-generational. I had one of our members was like in his 70s, to a bunch of college students, because again, this is at the seminary. So most of it was seminary and college students within my community, Black, white, Korean immigrants, Colombian immigrants. It was just a very mixed demographic. And as I was saying, shortly after getting my degree, alongside my wife, as we were both caring for people, we had several women that we were under our care who came forward to us, sharing with us, some very profound traumatic experiences that they had regarding violence, sexual violence, and other things. Real quick
Yeah.
rundown: I had a situation with a young woman, college age woman, college student, who just was a new convert, just a matter of weeks, and she told us, my wife and I, about this guy she was dating. While she was dating him, while they were alone in a room together, he did some things that were highly inappropriate. And when I brought it to the pastors were like, well, let's get that man and that woman in the room together and see if she'll accuse him to his face. And if she does and she's willing to, then we'll move forward from there. And I put my foot down and I was like, there's no way that I'm allowing this woman to get in the presence of this man and have to be in that situation. And that was the first really major head bump that I had with the leadership there, where we were on two completely different planets on how to care for and advocate for women in those kinds of situations. Long story short, that was probably the first experience where I had of something not being right, in the sense of me coming with this expectation that people within who hold spiritual authority and power, uh, which is supposed to be used to protect and to advocate and to care, being wielded in a way that was actually enabling violence or abuse or those kinds of things. That was probably the first time that I experienced it in that sense.
Yeah.
What would ultimately end up happening, and I'll pause with this, was there became an increasing amount of situations where wives of seminarians, men who are pursuing pastoral ministry, would reach out to me, or my wife, and then to me through email or through phone calls, and it would be like, "Help me." That my marriage, this is what's happening, this is what's going on, and that became kind of the norm. Where it was like, well, and that's one of the things that I would actually say is that, from my experience, and I've been doing crisis marriage counseling for 15 years, give or take, maybe maybe about 13 years, is that the most horrific situations and circumstances that I've had to engage have been with pastors or seminarians within that context, and I
Oh.
and I think
Oh.
I think that there's a reason for that, because I think that, and you may have heard people say this about how narcissists find the pulpit appealing because it gives them power and authority. Well, there's this thing where, especially within certain traditions, so you think about like Reformed evangelicalism, for example,
Yes.
where knowledge can serve as a mask of spiritual immaturity, where the more information you know, the more you're able to espouse Bible verses or
Wow.
theological openings and this, that, and the other. If you're able to articulate theological ideas really well and you show that you know a lot of things, that is you're automatically deemed as spiritually mature and wise and XYZ, and you're given power, you're given authority, you're given those things. And so a lot of times a lot of men would go to seminary, they would learn a lot of things, and then they're able to mask their immaturity or their lack of spiritual piety based upon how they're able to regurgitate information. And so if there is an issue in the home, they'll just quote a Bible verse to their wife about submission or something of that nature to kind of quiet her down. Or if there's something that they're wanting to push, and I mean, there's so many layers here in regards to the kinds of ways in which husbands will coerce wives, and you can probably read the innuendos there. They will just quote Bible verses at them, and because hey, I'm the seminarian, or I'm the one who's going to be a pastor, wives often just simply believing that they need to submit under that because their husbands know best. And so it was that trend that was happening that got me more focused on caring and advocating for largely women who were experiencing these things in the home and didn't have language to process it because their husbands were their pastors, or at least aspiring pastors in many regards. It wasn't until the most radical shift for me was when, in that space, there was at the advent of Trump, if you would, where that was all happening, and I was at the Southern Baptist flagship seminary, where things got so hostile for us that, even though I lived right across the street, like 2-minute walk from the campus, I took online classes for my last year because the campus became so hostile to me being there, talking about certain things. And oh God, I could tell you stories about things that were said in class, about various things that I would stand up against and standing alone. And so the atmosphere there got hostile. The local church got into a situation where, after several years of providing pastoral care, my wife and I were sat down by the pastors on our living room couch and were told point blank that you are already serving it as a full-time pastor in a pastoral capacity, but we can't give you that title unless you do a few things. One is you have to stop talking about Trump. And the other was I needed to stop talking about racial justice issues publicly on like social media. And then the third one was that I needed to work on a posture of pride that I had. And whenever I would ask them, what do you mean by that? Like, what is this? Like, well, it's just a vibe that you're giving off. And long story short, it was abundantly clear that it was a confident black man is prideful. And they couldn't give any accounts, they couldn't give any scenarios. Long story short, it was a profoundly traumatic season of life that this whole period of time that we went through. It led to a seriously dark season for my wife and I. Like, words can't describe how dark that season was.
Oh, I
But
know. I know.
I came out of it though from the with the perspective of like this is it almost ended me. Like literally, it almost killed me. And I was a theologian and counselor in that space, and that is the toll that it almost had on me. How much more so those that don't have the tools, don't have the language to be able to process what's happening like I did in real time. And it was like I don't ever want anyone to ever have to go through what I went through, uh, grasping at the heavens for answers or language to even understand the traumatic experiences that they're going through. And it was at that moment, after my family went through it, that I said, "This is my life. I will devote my life to trying to protect and care for and give language to, and educate as many institutions and organizations and churches as I can to prevent as many people as I can from having to experience the profound trauma that comes about through spiritual abuse."
Wow, like you have blown my mind. As someone, and I mentioned this before we got started, who predominantly was involved with the Southern Baptist Convention, via my ex-husband, who was, I mean, attended the conventions, was a considered a missionary for Southern Baptists by church planting in a predominantly black neighborhood, what was meant to be a multi-ethnic church in a predominantly black neighborhood. One of my ex-husband, as much as like we are actually divorced, we didn't have like a whole bunch of arguments, but a lot of the arguments were centered around how the SBC church that he was employed at was treating him, how the SBC church was treating me. They were having conversations about my social media posts supporting Black Lives Matter behind my back, to him. And I wasn't even employed there. So all of the things that you're saying about this very traumatic experience, like it resonates with me. And I told Cal earlier, I didn't know he was that involved with SBC when I asked him to be a part. I just, appreciated his work on spiritual abuse. But I think it was just divine that we would be connected in that way, because all of the things that you're mentioning, like I thought I was going crazy because of this treatment from this particular SBC church, and how it perpetuated this idea that if you are Black in some of these SBC spaces, that you have to assimilate. If you're going to grow in the SBC convention, you have to assimilate, meaning if you're going to go up in leadership, if you're going to be in a position to make any change, you have to believe what they believe. You have to believe and have, especially in the age of Trump. So when you say you felt uncomfortable going on campus, I believe you. I believe
Yeah.
you because without telling I try not to tell my ex's story for him, but I will say this, that one of the most contentious parts in our marriage was when his boss was basically telling him for about 8 months that he needed to talk to me about my social media posts,
Mm.
which was support, after the death of Alton Sterling, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and all my posts about Black Lives Matter. And this went on for almost 8, 9 months, that this woman was like screenshotting my posts and sending them to my husband and asking questions and asking why I was posting these things. And, and also telling him not to wear a hood in the building because the ladies that worked at the front desk were scared. And like, I'm like, I'm like, ma'am, we have bigger fish to fry in America. But so you answer a lot of my first questions about if there was a moment or experience where you realized this would be a part of your life's work. All of the things that you said in the beginning was is an answer to my first few questions.
Sorry.
Um, so no, that was perfect. You knew if you're going to yap about something, you knew what to yap about. So I appreciate it. So okay, for those that are listening, because even for myself, I am having to become more informed on the term spiritual abuse. So how would you define spiritual abuse and what would be some examples? Because
Yeah,
like I
absolutely.
said, even when I was like thinking through going through this like really traumatic infidelity situation, I didn't initially clock what had happened. It was like it happened and I found out about it and I started finding out more and more and more, and as I was finding out more I was like, okay, I really was like, this is a power dynamic. I knew that that was there. So how would you define spiritual abuse?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. And I can't tell you how much, but I want to contextualize your question in regards to how important it is by giving you a quick
Mhm.
story that maybe you can relate to, okay?
Yeah.
So, hypothetically speaking, right, within uh, general church culture, even say black evangelical culture, okay?
Hmm.
If everything what you just said to me about what you experienced, the infidelity, thinking about just the trauma of that alone, if you were to tell somebody within that space or that culture that you really struggled with going to church, that because in that what experience, because the impact basically worship can be triggering, by reading Bible passages can be triggering because that may have been weaponized and this, that, and the other. So being in that space
Yes.
or being in that community feels triggering. And so it's really hard for you to be there without your nervous system response. The most typical response that you would get is you really just need to strive to get over your church hurt.
Yes.
And I want to throw a grenade on that word church hurt because I can't think of anything more profoundly minimizing, downplaying, and dismissing the reality of spiritual trauma than that language of church hurt that is pushed largely by spiritual people in spiritual authority and leadership and influence that have reputations of causing spiritual trauma, who push this language
Yes.
of minimizing it to hurt when what we're really talking about is spiritual trauma. We're not talking about being upset because you didn't get selected to host a potluck. We're talking about someone who has violated or exploited something as sacred as faith. And so
Yes.
the reason why I really appreciate you, even how you framed that, is you didn't say, so how would you define church hurt? Because then I'd have to give a whole diatribe about how upset that language makes me. But no, you named it for what it actually is. We're talking about spiritual abuse, and what comes out of abuse is what we call trauma. And so, to answer the question directly, I'm giving kind of a kind of going coming around it because I really want to lay a foundation that's built upon that. Then I can start naming certain things. So when you think about what happened, and then just taking off the spiritual, just think about abuse in general, which is abuse is what happens when someone leverages or exploits their power in order to oppress another or to exploit
Hmm.
another for their own ambitions. The result of abuse is what we call trauma, and is often trauma. And one of the ways that I've often defined trauma is I've called it haunting pain. It's pain that is so profound and monumental that it doesn't just happen in an instant, but it actually carries you or haunts you throughout your life. And so if you bang your toe, that's painful, but it doesn't haunt you. But there's a certain kinds of experiences that someone can have that isn't just a momentary agony, but it's a perpetual agony that, again, that follows them. It impacts their nervous system, it impacts their psychology, it impacts the way that they function in life. And that is what happens when something that is abusive happens to an individual. Now, one of the things when it comes even to trauma, though, is that not everyone develops trauma, even if they experience the same thing. So you can have, like, I'm thinking about like soldiers, for example, in like say Afghanistan or Iraq. Two can witness a car bombing, right? One gets PTSD, the other one does not, or one gets complex trauma, the other one does not. We don't have control over how our brain processes things. But
Yeah.
when we're talking about spiritual abuse, what we are talking about is the exploitation and the violation or the betrayal of someone's soul. We're talking about something as the faith, which I would argue is sacred. I believe that faith in its of its, and I want to be clear here. When I say faith, I am talking about the most fundamental and foundational space within us where that houses our hope, meaning, and purpose. So faith is something that where when you think about faith, what is someone having faith in something? We're talking about their core, where the core of their meaning, purpose, and hope resides. And that is comprehensive. Yes, I am a Christian. I hold to a Christian faith expression, but
Mhm.
faith is not limited to just Christian believers. Everyone, every
Yes.
human being, by virtue of being made in the image of God, has faith, has a seed of faith, and there are things that rest there. And when we're talking about religious or spiritual abuse, what we're talking about is a violation of that most sacred space, where in ways and things that people leverages of their power that exploits, attacks, or betrays that sacred space where people's hope rests, where people's meaning, purpose, and identity most deeply rests. And so
Mhm.
and I would argue that that impact is one of the most profound devastations that someone can experience. Even when you think about something like a physical wound, I would say like, so say like physical violence, right?
Right.
Physical violence, the physical wounds heal. And this is what important. When we're talking about spiritual abuse or spiritual trauma, it's the recognition that because we are made in the image of God, because we're not just a human being and we're not just flesh, but we are both body and soul, that you cannot devastate the body without it also devastating the spirit or the soul. And so, in a domestic violence situation, yes, somebody may psychology may be impacted, their body may be damaged or devastated, but it also has a spiritual impact as well. And when we're
Yes.
talking about the church spaces, and you mentioned the SBC, I was one of the people on the front lines, actually speaking at some of the protest rallies about adding a registry of identifying sexual abuse people who committed sexual abuse against children. I was one of the ones advocating for that, speaking at those rallies and everything else. Which, as you may know, that ultimately was dismissed, and they didn't end up doing that. They just
Right.
passed leaders around to different churches when
Yep.
they get found out. That the sexual abuse that happens there is both physical, it's mental, and it's spiritual, because they're leveraging and weaponizing that sacredness of faith to do what they're doing and when they're causing harm. It's
Yeah, and
it,
I was going to respond to that too, and just say
yeah, please.
that um, when you're talking about it, I love your definition of faith. I will say that I've never heard faith described in that way. And when you think about faith, you think about the vastness of what it means for something to be ingrained in you from childhood. Mostly, many people have their faith that they've had the same same type of religious practice since childhood. So you take something, and that was the case for me as a pastor's wife. You take something that has been ingrained in you in these scriptures and all the things that you're talking about that can be weaponized and manipulated to suppress you, and you take everything that you know and your genuine faith experiences that you've had, whether it's experiencing God's love for the first time, whether it's you becoming saved, and then you wrap it up into, especially for me, pastor's wife. So the person who was my pastor was also my husband, so this person is not just my husband, he's also leading me spiritually, and I have the belief that he has more knowledge than I do spiritually, and is more, like, to your point, because you're having a lot of knowledge, the belief that somebody is incredibly spiritually mature, and then that person does things that are completely against what your faith practice is supposed to represent. Now the question I had for many years, it took a lot of unraveling, is what is the purpose of this faith? Or does this faith even
Hmm.
work? Does the faith
Yeah,
work for me?
yeah, and what you're touching on is again one of the things that I would say is the result. So let me give you a definition, and then I'll unpack a little bit more.
Okay.
So if we understand that the result of trauma is, excuse me, the result of abuse is often trauma, And we recognize that abuse in its general sense is the exploitation of power or the leveraging of power to the oppression of another,
Hmm.
typically for that person's ambition. And so when we think about,
Hmm.
various kinds of abuse, and side note, this is why it's so important. This is why Jesus amazes me so much, because Jesus did repackage power from how it was understood on a social societal framework. Because for Jesus and how he presents the power within the scriptures is that power is not a weapon. It's not to be weaponized for personal ambition, but rather it is a tool of service to be wielded to empower the powerless. Someone is who has power has been given a gift, a tool of service to use as a tool to empower others. And
Yes,
that's
yes.
most profoundly demonstrated in he who didn't count equality with God as a thing to be grasped, was willing to lower himself even lower than the angels. So Jesus, the most powerful being, is willing to relinquish his power and share it with others and empower others, allowing us, to become his family and to be glorified with him. So he's willing to share his glory with us. That is a demonstration, the most an embodied demonstration of how power is supposed to be wielded, which is giving it away, empowering others who are powerless themselves. And again, us in relation to sin and everything else. And so, likewise, what Jesus is modeling for us is the proper use of power is to steward it in empowering others or advocating and caring for others. And so, what ends up happening though is when power is taken and it's weaponized and exploited for personal ambition, abuse is occurring there. Now, when you're talking
Yeah.
about spiritual abuse, we are talking about the some distinctions there, some unique ways in which the certain elements that are used, or certain tools that are used to cultivate spirituality or spiritual vitality are not used to cultivate, but are rather weaponized and exploited to oppress. So again, the
Mm.
Bible, which is supposed to feed our souls, supposed to be food for our spirits, is supposed to encourage and comfort and those things, is now weaponized to oppress. And that can be it's been weaponized to oppress, black people. It's been weaponized to oppress women. And so when the Bible is used in that way, wielded to oppress others, the Bible is being used in a spiritually abusive manner in that way. When I think about when in the context of like domestic violence situation where a spouse or partner says I love you with this, and but they say that while they're beating their partner, and they do that with such a
Wow.
measure of consistency where that their partner begins to interpret love as hate as love, where this is the fact that he's hitting me, he's hitting me because he loves me. And
And that
so
and that
love, which is
rewires your
supposed to,
brain.
oh, it absolutely
I was just
rewires you.
agreeing. Yeah,
Right.
it rewires your brain. Like it makes you think that, and so much of my what I have done or how I have tried to process these experiences post divorce, is related to, and even how I see myself, how I view myself, how I relate to others, how I see relationships. And I'm saying all this just to say, to agree with you, but to also say, like, it's really
Yeah.
mind blowing because I know that the way that I view myself as a woman has changed. I know that the way that I view myself as a Christian has changed. And the part that was really hard for me, and maybe it's because I'm a very like soft-hearted person and I'm a very like I hate to call myself a cinnamon roll, but like I'm a little bit of a cinnamon roll. Like I can be to the point where I can be naive, and some of that is from the
Mhm.
neurodiversity, the things that we talked about, like the ADHD, possibly a little bit of the tism, and so I don't. I'm trying to see how to word this in a way. I don't understand why people are unkind and cruel. Like I genuinely, it cannot
Yeah.
compute in my mind. And so for a long time, I was trying to understand how someone who claimed to love me and also claimed to love others and served in the context of ministry and was a pastor could do some of the things that were done to me and done to others, to be honest with you. And so when you're talking about all of that, about just how trauma affects you long term, I really struggled because I was like, man, and this is just my honest, I'm sorry to anyone who's offended, but I was just like, how how could you do things knowing it's going to inflict this level of harm? You know what I'm saying? Like when you impose, I know people are just
Oh
doing
yeah.
things and they're living life, but like that this is gonna the person that you're hurting, it's gonna hurt, like it's gonna potentially completely rewire their mind, their brain, their nervous system, how they see themselves as a woman, how they interact with men moving forward. I just didn't understand that, and I felt like it felt so intentionally cruel. But to your point too, I wanted to ask about, because you were talking about how people can be impacted and how it can kind of be so like underneath the surface. It's not something that you can just see, all the time. Because for me, I didn't
Hmm.
know. People always ask me, they're like, well, did you know he was cheating on you? No, I didn't even, like, I was with him every single day. I observed him. There were a few things that I thought were weird, I will say that. But it was that naivete or just my natural personality that I just assume the best. I just assume, or I think, okay, maybe I'm a little jealous, or maybe I'm a little insecure, and maybe that's why I'm feeling that way. So my question for you, as you were talking, I was thinking about it. What are some common signs or either some subtle forms of spiritual abuse? Because I feel like
Yeah.
we've talked about it and talked about like a lot of like how it can impact people, but I think a lot of times we don't know that that's what's going on, because we
Yeah.
don't,
Oh,
it's not something
absolutely.
that's just out
Absolutely.
there.
Yeah, and I would throw in there, and I say this from a place of like it's humbling for myself as well, because I am a scholar, theologian, historian, and counselor, and yet I was in a long term abusive relationship with my church for several years,
Wow.
and so it's so that's one of the things that I want to say off whip is that it doesn't. And I'm gonna get on this in more deeper about how cults and spiritual abusive systems will operate, because it's not about intelligence, it's not about intellect, it's not how they appeal. Let me put a
Mhm.
quick pin on that, and I want to address something
Okay.
else real quickly because I think it might be helpful. So one
Yeah.
of the things that you said, and this is me kind of putting the care hat on, but one of the things you said was regarding like being naive. And what I would say is, nah, sis, don't use that language. There's nothing that you
Okay.
have said about you being naive, because naivete is what happens when someone is overly trusting. But you were in a covenant with someone. You were with someone who said, I love you. So there wasn't this like a random trusting of a stranger. That's a stranger in a big white van comes to you like, hey, you want some candy? Get in. You getting in is naivete. You
Mhm.
trusting someone who said I do, and you trusting someone who says I love you, and you trusting someone who says I'm here to shepherd your soul, that is not on you when they betray those realities and
Oh
those
my
and those
God.
commitments.
I'm gonna
And so
hide.
that yeah, yeah. But
Oh my
language is,
gosh.
yeah, so language is powerful, and I say that to you and anyone listening, but especially to my sisters that are listening, is because I know that is a very common thing, which is how did I fall for this, how did I fall? And it's like, listen, no, two things. One is people who are manipulators, whether they are like maliciously manipulators, or they just have certain characteristics that they've never dealt with over time that are manipulative characteristics. They It's not that they take advantage of weak people, it's that they take advantage of sincere people. It's good
Ooh.
qualities. It's actually those good, godly, kind, sincere qualities that are being exploited. It's not negative things. It's not naivete. It's not being gullible or foolish. It's not you being overly kind. No, it's you are the ones who will inherit the earth. You're the meek. You're the kind. You're the sincere. Those things. But that sincerity, yes, there could be a better cultivation of discernment, maybe, of like trying to discern something, but they're not characteristics or character qualities that are negative or weak. They're actually profoundly strong to be willing and able to trust someone. The problem is that people portrayed your trust, they portrayed their words and their honesty and their integrity. That's them, not you. And so I think that that's so
Okay,
important to
Dad.
understand. Yeah. And so, but moving beyond that, what I would say is a couple things. So one is when I mentioned before, and I want to use this language because we don't use it very often, but I think it's an important language to understand. And that language is the fact that, and this is what I would say about my own experience. When I was part of a Reformed evangelical church, that was part of this, Southern Baptist Convention. It was kind of a seminary adjacent church. The church to this day is still an esteemed church and all that other kind of stuff. I would say I was part of a cult. I would say that Reformed evangelicalism in its
Really?
entirety is a cult, and I would define, and I can break down systematically why I would actually say that it's a code, and I'm going to do a little bit of that right now in a second. But what is important to understand is that cults do not appeal to people's intellect. Even when you think about something like MAGA, why I would call MAGA a cult, it's not about there being dumb people. That's not what it's about. Cults appeal to people's deepest longings, and spirit and cult leaders are people who have a unique ability to discern the inner longings of a heart, and then they sell that inner longing a superficial filler. So they say this person longs for connection. I can tell that they have this deep longing for connection. I'm going to offer them a version of community that's going to meet that. And while I'm meeting that, once it's met, because I'm meeting that deep longing, they'll be willing to accept a whole host of things, even if it feels off to their nervous system or their instincts, because I'm filling that hole, that deep longing that they have in their heart. And so what ends up happening, so like you take me for example, I'll use me as the guinea pig. Going up through my teen years, because of ADHD and some of that tism, I grew up very isolated, very not understood. I actually joined a gang. I became a Crip when I was 14, 15 years old, searching for that longing.
Wow.
And Oh yeah, I guess it is kind of a grenade if you don't know
Yeah.
my testimony, but yeah, I
Don't
was
just be adding that you was gang banging. You was with the
yeah,
Crips
so
now. Come on now.
I joined a gang. I did all these things as a way, not because I wanted to be bad, but it was because a gang was a connection. I longed for connection. I longed for community, and that filled that hole in a superficial and profoundly unhealthy way. But when I
Wow.
became a Christian, the way that and what evangelism was for me was, here are these men. When I was in college, first semester of college, I actually met. It's this is a whole nother story. I won't get too deep into, but I was actually headed back to my dorm room to take my own life when I was approached by some college evangelists, some college kids who basically approached me and asked if I would be willing to meet with them for lunch to the following day. They didn't just come and just spill the gospel. Like, they said, "Hey, why don't you meet us for lunch? We're gonna have lunch." And that hope of future connection stopped me from going back to my dorm room and blowing my brains out, which I was fully prepared to do when that happened. So God is good.
He
But
is.
I do believe that they were sincere. But what I would then go on to say is that I ended up joining a church that I think was a toxic, it was a black non denominational Pentecostal church.
Hmm.
That church answered that deeper longing in my heart of connection. And and so I was willing to latch on. And even though there were some other red flags within that environment, some of that health, wealth, and prosperity stuff and everything else, I knew that that was off, but I didn't logical or reason it. It was this deeper longing in my heart is being met. When it came to like Reformed evangelicalism, I was always a avid reader. I've always been a philosopher and intellectual, and so it was offering me an intellectual faith along with that connection. And so I was willing to accept that because of what was being offered. And so I say all that to say that one of the things that is subtle, that kind of undergirds everything, is recognizing that one of the biggest uh, evidences or flags when you're in a toxic space is certain things that are seeking, or certain promises that are being made that are trying to leverage fulfilling that longing. Specifically, people are claiming in some way that they have the capacity to fill it for you. So, for example, let me give you some really practical examples. Okay, so one
Okay.
of the most common deep longings that people have is for connection, and especially people who have come from broken homes, or people who
Mhm.
have lived with in some degree of isolation.
Yeah.
Notice how often, and this may be a little bit controversial, but I'll stand by this. when you think about relational boundaries, right? And this is a whole nother conversation, but I typically will present relational boundaries when I'm doing like care work, saying that, hey, look,
Mhm.
think of it as concentric circles. You have a broader circle where you have your acquaintances or relationships. You have an inner circle that may be friends, and then you kind of have an inner sanctum where your closest friends and people that you trust the most, that's who you divulge your information. They're basically like your family, right?
Yeah.
And so you have these different layers for boundaries. But within church culture, complete strangers already begin using love language with you, brother, sister, mother, father, spiritual father. They bypass relational boundaries. It's a prerequisite to joining those cultures. Is a bypassing of relational boundaries where you have to accept people into your most inner space, relational space as family, just based solely on the fact that they believe in Jesus too, without
Wow.
any kind of trust deposits or anything else. And once that happens, you've already given complete unbridled access to you. So again, a complete stranger can, and in a church, as long as they're a member of a church, they can ask you the most personal questions, and you're like in the most personally accountable to them. Unless they're the pastor, then it only goes
Mhm.
one way. But that's a whole, but them
Exactly.
asking you, not
Exactly.
going back. That's a whole nother can of worms. I would say, and I know this is controversial, but I would say that immediately expecting or infusing love language within a space is a yellow to orange flag for me within a church context. Which, yeah, so like within black cultural dynamics, yes, we got, my sis, brother, and we relate to each other with a sense of safety based upon shared experience and cultural identity. But we're not, that doesn't come with this bypassing of relational boundaries that happens within those religious spaces and contexts where there's a form of love bombing that's happening there with total
Yes.
strangers. You're expected to relate to them in the most intimate language and connection. I'll pause
Yeah,
there.
and I wanted to note too with what you said, because I feel like I need to take notes as you're talking, because it's such rich information. And I was thinking about how that can be, and you alluded to that, how that can be abused with people that A, have not done the internal work and become emotionally healthy within themselves, or B, have a deep desire for community, or a deep, that is their like most, deep, dark need that has been since childhood, and so I can see how
Mm-hmm.
people can, even from in the black context, and I might get a lot of hate for this too, but it's just how I feel. The concept of like spiritual sons and spiritual fathers.
Mm-hmm.
I understand it to a certain degree, like, because I do feel a level of like closeness, and I don't have a father figure in my life at this point. And so I do see like my spiritual brother, my quote unquote spiritual brothers, or like my, people that are like one of my worship pastors, or who's a guy, or one of my actual pastors is a man. And so, there is a sense of like longing for that connection from a like a daughter son, I mean daughter father type of relationship. But I do think that that's a relationship that's built over time, and I also don't see the purpose of like focusing on that language when it hasn't been earned. I also don't just
Exactly.
I also think that the use of the language is also just kind of weird. But
Yeah. Yeah,
but
you touched on it. It's about that earning, and that goes back to something that you were saying before as well, where I would say that, that many people do kind of just try to coast on the concept of like of love, when again Jesus, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. The Bible's definition and category of love is that love is a verb, it's not a noun. It's a being that one enters into and then is at rest. It's a constant active engaging pursuing thing.
yes.
And so you can't say I love you and it not be an active engaging pursuit cultivating dynamic that is happening between you and that other person that's happening. And so again, when you say I love you to someone, that's such a powerful thing to say. That's such a powerful language to use. And if to use that and then operate in a way that contradicts that reality is to
Mhm.
redefine what that means in someone's consciousness in such a way that has devastating results. Because again, if you say I love you, but then you act in a way that is actually hateful, and you had
Yes.
mentioned this before, that is not a small thing. That is you attacking kind of a core a core emotion and affection
Mhm.
and idea of safety and peace and comfort to be loved by someone. That's really fundamentally core. And so to do that and then portray it is devastating. And
Yes.
but what often happens again within relationships, within marriages, within pastoral care dynamics, and this is something that I know we'll touch on more deeply, but talking about
Yeah.
like the power dynamics of pastor, with parishioners or this, that, and the other, to say you are someone's pastor, or and to say that's your posture towards them. That's not a passive thing. That's an active thing. And to
Yeah.
be someone's pastor, so you are saying that you have entrusted me with the care of your soul. Everything you do from that point on relationally has to reinforce that reality that I'm actually caring for your soul, not exploiting it. And at
Wow.
any point, in any juncture where that care becomes some manner of exploitation, spiritual abuse has occurred. So, because again,
Wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a
faith
minute,
is
wait a minute,
sacred.
wait a
Yeah.
minute. That is a like that is a mic drop. Say wait.
Yeah.
What?
I'll say it. I'll say it again. Let me unpack that.
Yes.
Whenever, so again, pastoral ministry. Um, So let me give two different categories.
Okay.
So this before I get to the past, let's talk about the lay people and the dangers of the language, the love language that's often used so flippantly and casually. When you call somebody a brother or sister, especially someone who has had profoundly harmful or devastating things happen to them on a relational level, like with their family, you say that,
Mhm.
but you don't carry the weight of that language with you in your interactions with them, then spiritual abuse has occurred. So if you say you're my
Because you're
brother, and then you
because you're
gossip,
reinforcing that belief. You're reinforcing that harm. Okay, that
you are
makes
you are
sense.
reinforcing, yeah, you are reinforcing something, love, of acceptance, of comfort that is so deep. It's not to call somebody and relate to somebody like you're my brother, you're my sister, we're like family. That's not just massaging a superficial desire for longing or connection. That's core connection that you're tapping into, and it's
Mhm.
profoundly powerful and profoundly
Yeah.
devastating. And that's one of my problems with that language of church hurt, where it's like, what are you talking about? What we're talking about is the agony of the soul. We're not talking about a pricked finger or somebody upset because they didn't have a potluck. That's church hurt. What we're talking about is when someone betrays love language of safety, security, connection, belonging, all of those things that a soul craves. You speak to someone with the reassurances that that's what they are to you, and then you exploit or betray that reality. That is spiritual abuse, and that is a soul level of betrayal. But it's only amplified when you're again within a pastoral posture, or within a not just pastor, but I would say like any religious influencer and these, and spiritual influence, people who have been entrusted with some level of spiritual reassurance or authority or those type of things, who
Mhm.
use that and relate to others in a way that contradict the entrusting that has been given to them. So again, a pastor is someone who has been entrusted with the care of souls, of care of someone's soul. And if that pastor takes that trust, takes that category of their posture towards someone, and they take advantage of someone, they exploit someone, they leverage that authority or that trust in a way that is for their own personal gain or ambition, spiritual abuse has occurred because they are exploiting a person's faith. They are exploiting the sacredness of
Wow.
faith by exploiting that the element that attaches to that faith. So again,
Wow.
think about the Bible.
That's
The
heavy.
Bible is something that people of faith, like of Christian faith, treasure. And again, I want to be clear here. This could be the Quran or something else as well, because this is go this spiritual abuse. That Christians don't have capital on spiritual abuse. It's comprehensive. But if you take
Hold
someone's
on, it's
religious text
I
that
can't hear you
they
again. Let me see what's going on with this.
okay,
I think it's just the internet. I don't think it's actually anything we're doing. Uh, let me see. Let
okay,
me see here.
because I can put in headphones if I need
No,
to.
it's not the actual sound. I think
Okay.
it's just the connection. I wanted to we were just talking about, man, like you're dropping gems. So I'm like, I'm all over the place because it's good information. So I don't at the risk of making it like 2 hours long because we will yap. I'm going to skip some of these questions, but I want to talk a little bit about, you were talking about your definition of like what spiritual abuse is, especially even as it relates to the lay people and the connection between the pastor and the lay people relationship. I think it was so rich, and that's the plainest I've ever heard it explained, and that's how I know that you do this work for real. Because even when I go to therapy, I don't think I've ever had it explained to me that way, and why it's been so impactful, not just to my own personal like mental health, but also my walk with the Lord. Because I had my period of time where I didn't know if I wanted to be a believer. I didn't know if, serving in ministry or even attending church. I didn't attend church like regularly for a very long time. And it took a lot of trust building work between myself and my current pastors for me to feel comfortable with trusting them. And then even people that were not directly harmed, and I'm using that lightly, by the situation, they were inadvertently harmed because I was connected to people that was a part of our former church. Because at this time, my ex is not the pastor of that church anymore, and he pastors another church. And so
Okay.
from there were people that were in our orbit, that were friends, that were church members, that really felt harmed because they felt like this person that has been advocating for abstinence and has been advocating for us to not cohabitate before marriage, and trying to like counsel us with our own wives and all this stuff, lo and behold, behind closed doors was doing this harm in his own relationship, and was having extramarital relationships in his own relationship. And so some of them, one in particular, I had a conversation with, and she had visited a church service with me, and that was during our my current pastor's anniversary. And she was saying like, man, like I really have some trauma because of what happened, because I'm really having a hard time connecting with how people are honoring their pastor and talking about how great they are and all this stuff. And she was like, I just I feel like I was, traumatized, even though I wasn't directly, in what happened, but I was still impacted by how I view pastors and how I view leadership. And so before I don't want to move past a conversation about consent, about what is true consent, because we talked about it a little before the
Mm-hmm.
podcast started. And it was such a good, rich conversation. I was like, wait, hold on, we getting too deep because it's too good. I need my listeners to hear that. So as it relates to consent, and when you are involved with someone that is a pastor that at the church you attend, or a person that isn't direct leadership above you, or maybe you're a pastor and you're engaging in some sort of extramarital or some sort of relationship between a pastor and a layperson. Like, talk to me about your definition of like true consent, and how those power dynamics impact consent.
Yeah, absolutely. Right before I get to that, if I just for a quick second, I do want to address this and say that,
Yes.
so in a church, and I'm going to make this general, just so it's not like I'm picking on yeah, anybody in particular, but in a general context where there's a pastor who has an affair or commits adultery and all those kinds of things, um, and other people within who are not directly involved, so it's not the spouse or the
Mhm.
person that they were having an affair with. Um, they're not directly involved, but they also have uh, spiritual trauma from what happened. What I would say to that is I would actually reframe that entire thing, and I would say you are actually directly involved. You're directly involved because this
Mm.
is still the man that you entrusted your soul to. So you may not be directly involved in the sense of action or like participation in some kind of form, but you are directly involved because within a community, which is what a church is, you have a community of people who have a certain kind of socio-relational, spiritual contract, if you would, that's in place. And what that is I am here, I'm worshiping here, and you, pastor, are the one I've entrusted the care of my soul to. And when you see somebody in that situation so drag the soul of another, specifically I'm speaking of betray love and betray their office and betray their status and everything to not only their spouse, but then also doing that by way of um I'm just going to say the language by preying on members of, and this probably answers one of the other things you're about to ask, but by
Yeah.
preying on members of the congregation, that relational betrayal is just as acute for any member of that church that is in that social contract, the social religious contract of entrusting this man with their soul, because they're now like, hey, this is wolf-like behavior, and I may not be the sheep that was participated with, but I'm still a sheep in this herd. So,
Wow. Yeah.
does that make sense? So
Yes.
it's still, so it's like a wolf preying on a sheep, and then the other sheep being like, "Yo, we may not have gotten eaten, but we're still in this herd, and it could have been us."
Yes, and
And
now I'm leery of wolves. Now I'm leery of wolves because
exact,
I don't want to deal
yeah.
with any
So,
wolf.
but yeah, and see, that's, to me, so many things I could say on that, but that is one of the things that one of the reasons why I think that there are certain behaviors that should be disqualifying indefinitely, and one of the reasons for that is because, think of it this way: if someone preys on a sheep, which is wolf-like behavior, but is able to stay in the position of shepherd, all that does is reinforce the reality that shepherds are wolves. It doesn't say, hey, there was a wolf that got into the status of a shepherd. We now know that the wolf is gone. We purified the office of shepherd. It's we moved this shepherd from, we removed the wolf from this spawn house, but we moved him over to another. But the office is still wolf, is still acceptable for wolves. And I say that, to me, that doesn't, the intentionality doesn't matter to that. I mean, I think that they're like malicious wolves, and then there's others who are not necessarily malicious wolves, but they've done wolf-like behavior to such a capacity where we're maintaining a specific status only reinforces what I talked about earlier, where you're now redefining something. Where for a sheep, now the shepherds can be wolves because wolves are kept as shepherds. And so that was my whole thing when it came to the Southern Baptist Convention and the registry thing was, no, when this has happened, the way that you reinforce the surety or the reassurance of the office of pastors, of men who care for souls, is you have to be like, you have to nuke it. You cannot have
Yeah.
you cannot have people that are still operating that in that space, because to the same way that love now becomes hate to the domestic abuse survivor, a shepherd is now a wolf within the consciousness and the language for the survivor of spiritual trauma or spiritual abuse. So I want to be
Yeah.
clear here. So
Yeah.
to me, it is both. It would be spiritually traumatic, and it would be spiritual abuse, not just towards a wife, not just towards the people, like the women, but also every member of the congregation, because every member of that congregation has handed over a part of their soul and entrusted it to a shepherd, and then it being betrayed.
Wow.
And so I can pause there or go straight to your question, your question of
Yeah, no,
the
you can go straight to the question. That was so good. I have some thoughts,
okay.
but I'll give them to you after this answer.
Okay. And so remind me of your specific question, because I kind of went on a tangent.
Yeah, no, I wanted to talk a little bit about, it was good though. It was good. I wanted to talk a little bit about just what defines consent then,
Oh
because
yeah, yes. Okay,
if
okay.
yeah, if you have two adults, and I think
So
I want, well, just wanted to say this because I'm
yeah.
struggling a little bit because I don't want to frame I don't want to frame all of this as the same. Like I don't want to frame like someone, preying on children and frame it,
Hmm.
someone being involved with just with a parishioner who's of adult age as all the same. because I don't
Yeah,
think that it's the
absolutely.
same.
Yeah, absolutely.
But when we talk about consent in the church, I do think that we are not aware of what a the separation of power can do to the relationships of consenting adults. And like we mentioned earlier, even from me, I teach older students at a community college, and I could not be in relationship with one of them. You know,
Mhm.
I work with many organizations where the people that are my subordinates are my age. And I cannot, and this is a non-religious organizations. I could not engage. They have fraternization policies and things like that. So, I just want to say that, like, when we're talking about consent, there's a reason why even secular organizations have rules based on, like, what is, you know, something that's supposed to happen and what is not supposed to happen. And even as far as to say, everybody saw the meme from the Coldplay concert. So, you
Mhm.
know, and that was a big thing. So I'm interested to hear your perspective on consent.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm gonna be very careful here because I'll tell you, like, I think this whole episode could have a trigger warning on it, but I want to be careful
Yes.
here because I tell you who I have in my mind primarily, who I have in my mind, who
Okay.
I it's not children because I think at universal we used to be able to say this, right, that universally protect the kids, but now in our but
I
I'm
know.
gonna say us as we're looking at each other in this conversation, I think, and with your listeners, I think that there can be a consensus that when it comes to children, there's absolutely no way that a child can consent. So that we can put that we can
Yes.
anchor that. So I'm thinking about adults, and based upon my work as a crisis marriage care provider, it's doing the work that I do with spiritual trauma and all these things. The two groups I
Mhm.
have in my on my mind, the first one is and is women who have experienced coercion within their marriage when it comes to sexual intimacy based upon the leveraging of Bible passages and male authority in the home.
Wow.
That's
Yes.
the first group. And even saying that, I'm getting a little bit choked up because I have a lot of thoughts and feelings about that, and I wanted to touch on that, and I will touch on that. But that's the first group. The second group I have are blurred lines when it comes to what constitutes the capacity to consent, is how I would frame it. Because
Yeah.
when you think about adults, so children have no ability to consent. When you think about adults and consent, the category more falls within the line of, excuse me, of the what constitutes the capacity to consent. And what I mean by that is, I'll give you a couple quick examples. Is I don't know if you ever saw this video of Trevor Noah. He was telling a story about being on a date and having kind of a nightcap and going
Yes.
back
Yes.
to the home. And he says, oh, the girl was like, oh, I don't know if I should be here. I had, too many drinks or this and the other. And Trevor Noah was like, I am so glad you said that. Let me call you a cab. And she's like, no, I don't want to go home. He's like, I'm not even trying to be a jerk, but the fact that you said that tells there's blood lines here regarding your
Yes.
capacity to consent. And so it is better that we do this when you're sober minded and everything else than anything else. That was brilliant coming
Brilliant.
from him. It
Yes.
was response. And I've had engagements with account when I've had to give language to certain things where it's like, to a woman, no, you did not have the capacity to consent.
Yeah.
Side note, also to men as well, that you did not have the capacity to consent.
Right.
And what falls into that is a couple of things. One is anything. So, and again, I have sons. This is one of the things I've told my sons is that y- y- anytime you are out drinking or this, that, and the other in the future, my sons are teens, but anytime you're with a woman who has had any kind of consumption of alcohol or anything else, everything else is off the table at that point, because inebriation, any type of intoxication, automatically removes anyone's capacity to have full unbridled 100% surety in consent. And so that is something that needs to just be anchored and understood and take and like
Mhm.
always. And so you have, like, again, intoxication or those type of things with lack of capacity. The other thing, and this is kind of I think what we're getting more, what I'm, or at least what I would think about within all context, is the way in which power removes a person's capacity to consent, because it you cannot measure the toll or the role that power-based pressure has within that consent, if there is a power dynamic at play. So let me say that
Yeah.
in a real simple way, which is, if there's a situation where one person is like a boss or has any kind of authority or power over the other. So, like within a church context, that can be, again, a pastor is an authority figure, is a power figure, has power in regards to spirituality, all those kind of things, is entrusted, as I said before. That is spiritual authority and power. Anyone that is under that or has entrusted him in any kind of in that capacity is becomes is does not have the capacity to consent, or the capacity is cannot be measured with surety from that person to be able to actually move forward with something. So someone could say,
Yeah.
"Hey, yes, I'm down. I'm enthusiastic. I want this." And but if you have authority and power over them, you do not have the capacity to weigh whether or not your influence or your authority or power is having any role in regards to their enthusiasm. And so confidence cannot exist within that dynamic, within that framework. And
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
literally cannot. And the smallest amount of humility has to recognize that I hold an office. This office is an office of authority and power, spiritual authority, spiritual power. There cannot be. I cannot know whether or not even a 1% chance or 1% of that power authority is playing a role here. If her seeing me in the pulpit, if her seeing me, this, that, and her seeing me lead a Bible study, if that is playing any role in regards to pressing her into me, or calling her to me, and then my power, my position, my privilege is playing a role in this consent. And
Yes.
so that makes, so a person can be like, hey, I'm fully enthusiastic, but they don't necessarily know whether or not what role that person's influence plays, and that person cannot know
Yeah.
that. And so consent cannot exist, within that framework. And again, the secular world understands this, which is why, bosses and employees are forbidden from having relations. It's a huge, massive problem when that happens. You mentioned the whole human resources thing. I actually think that there's a level of difference in that.
Mhm.
And this is a whole nother thing that we won't get into right now, but it's important to understand. Don't get me wrong, it's still problematic. But human resources, many people think that human resources exist to advocate for employees. They do not. A human
Right.
resource agent exists to advocate and protect the boss, the CEO, the company, the institution, and
Right.
everything else. So her job in life, her vocation, her career is protecting that man and
Hmm.
protecting the institution or the empire that man runs. That is a power imbalance to the core. And so even if she's consenting and she's an adult, this, that, and the other, she cannot know what level that plays, because her literal career is to protect and defend this man.
Exactly.
And so that in and of itself is inherently toxic, and consent cannot be present. We live in a
Mhm.
society, though, and this is important to say, where, because of the way that the patriarchal, misogynistic structures of our society, whenever anything happens, the blame comes to the women. And
Always.
it never is ever considered about the role of influence or power that man has. And or should be conscientious of, even if they're going to be holding a position of power, what it
Yes.
is. So one of the things I do when I've traveled and spoken at seminaries and churches and institutions and parachurch ministries is I have sought to help those companies and organizations understand power dynamics, and the leadership to understand the power they hold. Because I will say this: from my experience over 15 years, the vast majority of pastors have no clue regarding the power they wield. They do not understand the spiritual authority and influence that they have in people's lives. And because they
Mhm.
do not understand that, they move in a very, very sloppy way when it comes to the actual care of souls. They may
Wow.
preach well, they may do Bible studies, they may help in a lot of ways, but because they don't understand how much power they have in regards to when people entrust them with the care of their souls, they move, they articulate, they relate in certain kinds of ways that takes that for granted, and it's only amplified when it becomes any kind of thing like that's in the context of romantic. If I
Wow.
could,
Yeah.
I know that was a lot, so let me take a breath,
Well,
and I want
I
to,
wanted to say I
but
wanted to say one more thing too to what you
yeah,
were saying.
that's
Um,
fine. I just want to make sure that I touch on the other thing that I said about uh, marital rape, more or less. So I want to
yeah.
touch
Okay,
on
go
that,
ahead. Yeah, go
but
ahead.
please, you feel free to give feedback on what I just said.
Yeah, no, it was so good. And you know, this topic is not specifically just about my situation. I bring my situation in it because it was the first time I really kind of sat with what it could mean to be with someone who is in a position of leadership in a church. And if that person is not aware, the awareness
Hmm.
is like the thing. You know, a lot of times we would joke about some of the very strict rules that some churches would have in regards to men and male and female interactions when you are a pastor or a person of leadership. But it's like, and almost thinking that it was too strict. But I understand because, you know, you have to have an awareness. But the other word that you used was humility, because it takes humility to acknowledge that a situation that you're in could have been influenced by the power dynamic and not just somebody who wants to be in relationship with you so badly, you know, that they're okay with, you know, whatever. Now of course we can, you know, in my particular situation there was another layer of especially as you were talking about HR. There were two instances. One in which one of the young ladies that was involved in the situation actually wrote a statement that was read at a board of directors meeting, for the church, board of elders meeting, for the church. And in the letter, and I've never said this publicly, but you're getting it out of me. In the letter, she talks about um her mother basically saying, like, you know, teaching her growing up that, like, if a man does something for you, you kind of have a responsibility to do something for him. And
Hmm.
you know, someone being a pastor, you know, exhibiting a lot of financial help and actual physical help and emotional support and help, there was a sense of like burden on her to feel the need to enter in some sort of relationship with my ex-husband. And so, as a woman, you know, and I think I know that it takes a lot of resilience and perseverance and even courage for me to not just write this woman off and just say, oh, she's a bleep, 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 you know, but to really feel like, no, let me just see what would make her, you know, enter into this type of relationship with somebody that she knows is, you know, is married. You know, what would, like, what I have a lot of compassion for people regardless of if they have hurt me or impacted me. I do have a lot of compassion. And so when you were talking about it, it reminded me of like, you don't know why people do the things they do. Sometimes people have like a thought process from childhood that influences how they view men in leadership and men in power. And even if, and that's another reason why, you know, like, you know, even if you're not sure, or even if you don't believe a power dynamic exists, you know, like, it takes humility to entertain the possibility, you know,
Hmm.
and just be open enough to say, okay, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I shouldn't have engaged with this. Maybe I should have, you know, found somebody outside of the church or whatever. But I want you to say your point about, as we near our close, I want you to say what you were going to say about, you know, marital violence, because I think that's an important point to mention as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I do want to make clear, and is that most of what I'm talking about, even when I'm laying things out, even when I'm talking about pastors, one of the things that I have learned from my work has been the fact that um, the vast majority of things that I've seen and experienced has not been maliciousness; it's been profound ignorance. of which isn't any better in a sense. It's just different. Where it's kind of like
It's different. Yeah.
you don't men that don't know better. They don't understand their power. They don't understand. You can't hold the responsibility for it if you don't even understand it. And the entire structure or system of how pastors are trained is to hyper focus on the information, hyper focus on the presentables, like presentable piety of like this and the other, but not actually really
Yes.
cultivate and nurture the actual character and souls of individuals and build kind of emotional intelligence. There's a profound lack of emotional intelligence that's cultivated amongst people in positions of spiritual leadership, specifically
Mhm.
men. And it's not necessarily maliciousness, but this is my main thing that I want to say is that you don't have to be an evil person to abuse other people. Most people who end up actually abusing others
Wow.
did not intend to do it. They didn't wake up one morning saying I'm going to be this way. It was a profound lack of emotional intelligence, lack of humility, lack of awareness, and maybe ambition and various other things that led them to move in a certain kind of way that caused profound harm. But it wasn't maliciousness. At the same time, I know people that I would say, no, that person was evil. They had the opportunities to reverse course, and they chose evil. They chose a path of evil, knowing it was a path of evil. But those are two
Wow.
different things. And when you're talking about, even what I'm about to talk about when it comes to like marital coercion, what I would say, and this is, oh man, there are a lot of husbands who have sexually assaulted their wives and they don't know it, but the wives carry the trauma in their nervous system of what happened to them. The
Yes.
husbands don't know it because they were brought up in a cultic culture that normalized it, that said it was okay, and even what it was even obligatory for wives to basically be at the ready whenever they desired. And so, even if a
Mhm.
wife gives hints, even if a wife says no, that's seen as disobedience or sin or anything else. And it's not that they're maliciously trying to oppress their wives or assault their wives. It's that the entire culture is so profoundly cultic and toxic that they move in such a way that causes profound harm on women, and many marriages even end not as a result of an evil husband, but of a husband that was raised in an environment that was so toxic that the overflow of it caused so much trauma that the repair was just too much. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes perfect
and
sense.
and that's the thing. It's not that it couldn't be repaired. I'm one of those people that I say that I have supported divorce. I have even in many ways have affirmed and walked with people through divorce. But I also believe that there's always a possibility and potential for healing. But there is the legitimate reality that sometimes trauma runs so deep and is so comprehensive that the balance between what it would take to repair versus the cost of what has already been endured is just so
Yes.
catastrophic and
Great.
so much
Yes.
that for healing and for flourishing, it's better to part ways. And that happens a
Mm.
lot within a conservative Christian context. And so,
Yeah.
with that being said, kind of adjusting real quick, because again, just want to get a word out here, is that one, first and foremost, as I said a second ago, there are many women who have in their nervous system have feel like I didn't consent, but I don't have the power to consent. That being in the faith, believing in Jesus, believing in the Bible, believing in all these things, consent is something that's taken away once I say I do.
Wow.
And what ends up and that their life their role in life now is within that concept of submission is that they are to submit to their husband's desires in a way where they have to sacrifice their own bodily individuality and autonomy, and they carry the disconnectedness of knowing something deep inside them that that's not right. But then the faith component is because of how it's been said, is retelling them like, no, this is what you need to do. And I want to first and foremost say that I see you and I understand that tension, not personally, but just because of the women that I've walked with through that reality. And what
Hmm.
I would say is that that is by no means whatsoever how any of this should function. That it is an expression of spiritual abuse to be in a situation where someone has um, used the Bible or used faith, and we talked about what faith is, like the core of your hope and purpose and meaning, has used that and manipulated or twisted it in such a way where you now your identity is intrinsically tied to your husband's desire rather than to your own personhood and your own humanity. And it is a expression of spiritual abuse when a woman is in a situation where she cannot say no because she is married, that somehow marriage nullifies a no, when in reality a man who's operating in the capacity of actually submitting to love and is operating as love being an active verb, not a passive noun, that would
Yeah.
be a husband who's willing to see and understand and not force, not coerce, not pressure, but be willing to reinforce his wife's own autonomy, including those things. And so again, so I think that when it comes to consent, I think one of the biggest unspokens as it relates to the church and consent, because again, child abuse is spoken. Even
Yeah.
consent conversations is spoken when a pastor is like with a parishioner, people are like, yo, that's side eye. But what often
Right.
happens is kind of silent and kind of goes under the radar, and it happens way more often than many people think. Oh, is that is
Yes.
women who have submitted to a framework where they have accepted a loss of bodily autonomy and have accepted bodily submission because the faith, scripture, all these other spiritual expressions has reinforced them that they must say yes.
Oh.
And they live under that pressure, and that does create that haunting pain that I mentioned earlier, that trauma, that spiritual trauma, where you have to reconcile because of how it's presented. If I'm going to be of the faith, then I have to relinquish my bodily autonomy and independence. And so those
Mm.
things are put at odds where either abandon the faith and be free or accept the faith and accept the expression of bondage. And I would say that no, what you're actually dealing with is a, a faith that has been manipulated and twisted, that is telling you you have to accept oppression in order to hold it, when that's not the case. You do not need to give up your ability to consent, to say yes, to say no in order to have Jesus.
Last thing I wanted to ask was just, how, if you have someone that might be struggling with spiritual abuse, tell me, what would you say to that person? What would you say to that person that might be trying to figure out if they're in an abusive situation or not? And how would you suggest they get out?
Yeah, that's a good question. So that's a really good question, and I'm gonna answer that question. There's two ways. So I'm gonna avoid the second answer, which is in some ways like self marketing. I'll put that off to the side. I'm just gonna answer like the free session for a quick quick second. So first and foremost, what I would say is one, it's important that you recognize that nothing is wrong with you, that what one Jesus grieves, that faith is something, as I said before, faith is sacred, it's holy. Your faith is sacred and it's holy, even as you're figuring it out, not your doctrine. I'm not talking about doctrine, I'm talking about your faith. Whether you go to church or don't go to church, if you can make it to church, or on Sunday your head is buried under your pillow and you can't even make it out of the bed, either way your faith is still sacred. That core of you, where your hope is, even if it's struggling or even if it feels empty, where your longings are, where your desire is, where your desire to be seen, to have connection, all of those kinds of things is sacred. And when that is disrupted, the need to for your nervous system to recalibrate can take time. And in that time does come everything from suspicion to concern to worry to trying to prioritize safety and all these kinds of things. And so, as you're trying to work things out, even if that looks like distancing yourself from various faith expressions like church and all these other kinds of things, to understand that one, God understands and is not, God does not process that as unfaithfulness or lack of sincerity. He understands the complexities of the human body, of the human mind, of the human spirit. And when that has been abused or ravished, he understands the process. And so he's not judging. He loves you and is there for you whether wherever you are. The other thing I would say is that, and this is something that I tell my clients often, is that God dwells in the darkness. He doesn't dwell in the darkness because he is dark. He dwells there because he knows that's where his people will often be. That he knows that, especially the people, his people, and this is kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, his people who desire to be kind, desire to be loved, desire to experience connection, who are sincere in their trust, who seek to entrust their soul into someone who God has ordained to care for it. He recognizes that such people, the meek will inherit the earth. Such people are people whom this world will take advantage of. And they will be people who have qualities that are godly, that are Christ like, but that this world will seek to devour. And so he is there in the darkness for whenever they are in the darkness. And even if they're wading through the darkness now, he is there to help care for them, to embrace them, to comfort him. Most of my work is helping people to find God there. To because when there's spiritual trauma, it can be everything becomes it becomes very hard to feel God in the darkness. It feels isolating. It feels alone. It feels hopeless because again, the core, your faith has been devastated. So the things that sit there, your hope, your identity, your meaning, your purpose, all those things have been devastated. So I would that's probably how I would primarily define the nature of my care work is helping people find where God is in the darkness so they can reconnect with him while they are there because it's not a shot where then you're automatically better. It's this dynamic of if I'm going to wade here, you don't have to wade there alone. You can wade there with somebody who can help walk you through it, and more importantly, you can wade it through knowing that God is there with you. He's there embracing you. If you can't feel it because your nervous system is too lit, it doesn't mean that he's not holding you. And to recognize that he is and learn how to see and experience his presence. And yeah, so I'll stop there with any feedback.
No,
There
that
may have been
was
a second part of your question.
No, that was so good. And it not necessarily a second part, but you've talked about you working with clients and working with people that have had these experiences. So if you want a good yap session, you can find Kyle on Threads. But also if somebody wants to connect with you in this work, tell us a little bit about what you do now and how a person could connect with you if they wanted to work with you. Like, what do you do one-on-ones? Like, tell us about the work that you do day to day.
Yeah, so pre-COVID, I've always done one-on-ones. My passion is one-on-ones, and meeting with people, talking with people one-on-ones. I do love to preach. I love to speak. Before COVID, I did a lot of traveling, as I mentioned before, at different churches, seminaries, institutions, teaching about power dynamics, teaching about spiritual abuse, and I guess you could say that my ambition in that was to try to stop it before it happened where it was like
Right.
if I better educate these institutions and these churches, then I'll have less clientele on the flip side. What I learned, sadly enough, over and over again, was a lot of these places don't want to change. The amount of times where I went there, I've literally led lectures only to then have people from those spaces come saying, "This is what happened to me," and so it's like,
Wow.
ah, I haven't given up on doing that, but I haven't traveled in a while at this point. I'm still open to teaching and educating communities, churches, small groups, all those kinds of things about power dynamics, spiritual abuse. Having kind of like collective session time. My primary work right now is twofold. What I've typically have always done like hour sessions. So I largely work alongside clinical therapists. So most of my clients
Mhm.
have therapists as well. But as you probably know, if you've been to therapy, a lot of therapists are not trained in spiritual abuse or cult like dynamics and those type of things. And
Right.
so they can help in some levels, but on other levels, like on the pastoral side or giving language or theology or helping to reconstruct or and all those things that they don't that's not really their wheelhouse. And so what I
Yeah.
have often done is I've walked alongside clinical therapists where I provide the spiritual pastoral guidance and that's trauma informed. And oftentimes my clients will either record sessions or take what we talk in sessions and take it to their therapist, maybe unpack it there.
Mhm.
But I've worked in conjunction with. Uh, and so that's probably my primary thing has been providing soul care, consultation, and guidance to people, either individual, like just solely, or in conjunction with their therapist. And the other thing that I do is I have a Patreon account that people contribute to my Patreon. And when they contribute to my Patreon, that money basically is like a scholarship for clients who can't afford care. And so the money that's given to me
Wow.
in Patreon, that'll cover the expenses of survivors. Largely, so again, my work is comprehensive. I do crisis marriage care, I do singles care. It's comprehensive, but my specialty is trauma care for spiritual abuse and racial trauma. And
Wow.
so those who give to the Patreon, and if someone's interested in giving to that Patreon, when I have a client who can't afford it, like even right now, I have like some single mothers who can't afford to provide care, so I meet with them weekly free, and that I tap into that Patreon to cover the expenses because again I have four kids and a fifth on the way, so that's how I'm
Sheesh.
able to. I still got to feed my family, but I can do it while still. I don't think that anyone should be hindered from care because of their finances,
Yeah.
especially when what we're talking about often is economically costly. Like even as I mentioned my Patreon at the height, I was probably getting about three times the support that I receive now. So my clientele of free clients was three times what it is now. But
Got
that was
it.
when I was largely working with within the evangelical space, and so I was meeting with white clients as well. Now I'm primarily focused on black and brown, because long story short, there was a situation with a nonprofit evangelical organization that focused on caring for survivors who I through my clients I had who actually worked for them came to me and showed me how they were being spiritually abused by that organization. And
Wow.
so when I tried to meet with them and have a conversation with them and help them be better, they went on a discrediting campaign where they tried to make up a whole bunch of stuff. It was chaos. But I also lost a ton of support
Mm-hmm.
doing that work. And but after that, my commitment was, you know what? I'm done trying to help evangelicals be better. I'm going to
Right.
focus on caring for those who have been impacted by their refusal to be. Yeah. And
Exactly.
so again, so the two ways you can either if you want to become a partner, you can partner through my Patreon. And again, that goes, as I said before, to me creating content and caring for people. And then I am taking clients now. My website should be up within a week, but basically my structure is whether it's for actual like trauma informed care or if it's just like coaching or a consultation or guidance. I
Mm-hmm.
used to charge just simply 150 an hour for one meeting. That's changed to
Right.
150 a week, where it's ongoing coaching. So there'll be like an hour session of what's going on, helping you process, going through things, and then throughout the week being a support and a resource to help people, process through what they're going through. And so I am
Okay.
taking clients, helping them to provide them with language to understand what they've been through, help them with their healing process, or even if they're at the point of trying to reconcile faith with their trauma, where they're like, hey, I want to still be a Christian, but I need some reconstructing because I've had some toxic Christian teaching. My historical theology background allows me to help people rebuild their faith identity and systems in a way that is freeing and empowering rather than oppressive.
So good. Yeah. Well, I am so happy and so pleased that you accepted my invitation to be a part of what we're building here. I really do think you are the perfect person. Like we could yap for hours. Like
Yeah.
I could truly talk about this topic and talk with you for hours. So I really think if you are listening and you have, been like me and gone through certain situations where you're not sure if it was an abusive situation, you're trying to figure that out, especially in the context of ministry. I implore you to reach out to Kyle Howard. Like I said, he can be found on Threads. He likes to have a good time on Threads. That's why I
Yeah.
found him through Threads. But he also will have his website up, so of course you can Google him. By the time this episode comes out, his website will be up. And so I just want to thank you again for all of your work. And, as you were talking, like, he's about to have five kids, guys, five kids. So My prayer for you is that, God truly blows your mind in regards to the work that you do. It's important work. You're caring for the vulnerable, the least of these. You're caring for the ones that need it the most. And I think that anytime you try to do that type of work, you're going to see major opposition, major. I've seen it in my own work with trying to provide literacy initiatives to kids. Anytime I have these big, grand, bold ideas, the devil is
Mm.
like, no, you're not going to do this. So, my prayer for you is that the Lord just like blows your mind. Like everything that you desire, I just pray that he expands it like tenfold, 20 folds, that the Lord really just shows you that he sees what you're doing. I know
That
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 you
means a
know
lot.
that, but like I pray that he just you get a very, very obvious, it's obvious,
Yeah,
that he
I
just
yeah.
blesses you.
I really appreciate that, and I was saying without getting too deep into it, it is the work is costly. We've been doxxed. We had to relocate after people showed up at our house,
Wow.
and with my wife and kids in their room, having to lock the door, not knowing what's going to happen. I've had a $3,000 bounty put out on me at one point because of the work that I do. It's
Wow.
the people under and I know, especially for Black and brown people, especially in this time, the work is costly. But my
Mhm.
my dream and ambition is just to do more of it, and to just
Yes.
expand, to be able to reach more people, help more people process. As I said before, no one should ever have to experience the devastating reality of spiritual trauma and or spiritual abuse, and especially go through it alone. So yeah, if even my stuff will be up, but if any of your listeners want to get a hold of me, and I'll give you my contact information. They're more than welcome to reach out to
Yes.
you, and I'll connect with them. And listen, yes, I do my formal work, but if you just want a question or you have something that you just feel free to hit me up, to email me. I'm not in this for the money by any stretch. I'm in it to encourage and to comfort and encourage. So yeah, feel free, if anything I've said has resonated with you, and you have any follow up, feel free to reach out.
Yes, and I would definitely connect you as well if you reach out to me. This is social justice work, guys. I know we talk a lot about what social justice is, and some people don't want to be labeled a social justice warrior or whatever they were calling people a few years ago. But social justice is just the concept of seeking I want to say reparations, but potential repair from harm from social issues and abuse in church settings, evangelical settings is a social issue. And so, our goal and my personal goal is for people to find their healing through our topics and through our podcasts and the conversations that we're having, so that their eyes can be open, so that they can be free. You can't be free from something that you're not aware that you're in bondage. So you have to have the knowledge and be equipped to just first name it and identify what you're suffering through, so that you can seek out the proper tools and the proper resources to get freedom. And so I mentioned all of those things being my prayer for you, for everybody that's listening. Like I said, if this resonated with you and you want more information, please reach out to either myself, who I can connect you with Kyle, or Kyle himself, on all his networks. And I hope you guys, really sit and resonate with this episode. It's definitely like life changing for me, eye opening for me. I got through it. I didn't cry. The Lord is kind. So anyway, I hope y'all enjoyed this episode, and we'll see you next time. Bye.